Good evening. My name is Joe Zweig, and I am the former Director of Behavioral Health Services here at Jawonio, and I'm still hanging around and doing some additional work. And we're going to be talking about this concept of integrating recovery, rehab and recovery services into the world of autism spectrum challenges. And I'm going to be joined later on by Thomas and Stephen, who are the people who will really have the important information to share with you. They are folks who have been involved in the rehab and recovery journey, and they'll be sharing some of their experiences with you. In the course of the presentation, I'm going to be referring to our PROmiSe program. And for those of you that are not aware of what a PROmiSe program is, there are about 90 of these programs throughout New York State. And PROmiSe is an acronym for Personalized Recovery-Oriented Services. And it's an opportunity for people to participate in structuring their own recovery journey. And I'm going to be explaining what the components of the PROmiSe program are in a little while. And I just want you to be aware of the fact that when we talk about PROmiSe, it is a very specific program that we have here at Jawonio. So let's start by talking a bit about the recovery model. And the recovery model is predicated on the idea that everyone is capable of change and improvement. And regardless of what a person's diagnosis, and frankly, we don't talk a lot about diagnosis here at Jawonio. We're much more interested in people's goals and expectations than we are in what their diagnosis is. And everyone is capable of developing dreams and aspirations, and it's our responsibility to help them find the tools that will help them get closer to that. In addition, the recovery model is predicated on the idea that the participant is an active architect in their own change. And I'm sure many of you have heard the idea of not about us without us, and that's what the recovery model promotes. Nothing happens that is not initiated by the person who is the participant in the recovery process. And you've probably also heard the saying, once you've seen one person on the spectrum, you've seen one person on the spectrum. And the same thing is true for the recovery model. Once you've seen one recovery plan, you've seen one recovery plan, because every one of these are unique and they're a reflection of the planning of the individual involved. So, how did Jawonio wind up getting involved in integrating services for folks on the spectrum and using the recovery model? And it's because Jawonio has been employing the recovery model through most of our services, and the fact of the matter is, it's in our DNA. The idea that a person is always moving towards change and moving towards improvement exists in our children's services, in our adult services, including pre-employment and employment services, our day services for adults and seniors, of course our PROmiSe program, care coordination, and it also exists at Cornerstone, which is a FQHC, a health clinic that's located here at Jawonio. So, why is there a need to design these specialized services? The challenge is a person's capacity to manage the demands that we indicate here on the slide. And the fact that something is biological may indicate that it's hardwired, but that doesn't mean that it's a static state. A person, I have vision impairment, so to speak, and I wear glasses. If I wear glasses, I'm able to see clearly. And the same thing is true with behavioral challenges, including spectrum challenges. The fact that there may be some genetic coding doesn't alter the fact that change is still part of the landscape. When it comes to the psychological factors, building self-esteem and resiliency can sometimes feel like we're swimming against the tide because we operate in a culture that frequently imposes certain expectations of limitations on folks who may be on the spectrum or have other behavioral health challenges. And that's where the PRO's community and philosophy comes in, because that is not our belief. The fact that somebody is challenged in an area that may be seen by the general public as being a permanent state does not imply in any way that change is not possible. The social factors, it's just part of the landscape that there is going to be stigma and trauma and at times rejection that will be experienced by the people that we work with. And just like PTSD, it can be overcome if we use the right strategies. So, how did this integration develop? It actually was something that was fairly organic. Our PRO's program was located in a building that also had services for folks with developmental disabilities, including folks on the spectrum. And even though each of the programs took place in their own areas of the building, there was just a natural and spontaneous interaction among the participants. And we were learning that the expectation that programs needed to be kept separate was really a false assumption. There was a really nice community feeling that was developing. And in addition, in our developmental disability funded programs, we were providing more and more recovery oriented services, and especially in the vocational area, Access VR, supported education. These are all programs that are made available to our folks who may have OPWDD funding. OPWDD is Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, as many of you know, and are still true to the recovery model. One of the things that occurred among our PRO's participants, they recognized that in their own experiences, they had been exposed to stigma and prejudice when they may have self-identified as having mental health challenges. And when they had the opportunity to interact with some of our participants who were in our developmental disabilities program, some of whom had significant physical disabilities also, they couldn't have been more welcoming and more patient and more desirous of sharing the recovery experience with their neighbors. And they were demonstrating to us on staff that this is something that is just a spontaneous and welcome function of the human experience. We also knew, because we are constantly monitoring the experiences of our residents and our participants in our day program, that at the time our PRO's program began, that 40% of our participants in the developmental disabilities program also had a psychiatric challenge of one sort or another, and may in fact have had a psychiatric diagnosis. So when you're developing a program such as this, where you are trying to combine behavioral health services with services that are generally associated more with developmental disabilities population, one of the first challenges was staff training. Training, just like funding, is frequently siloed, and people who have been a part of the developmental disabilities world frequently don't get a lot of additional training in behavioral health practices. And likewise, people in the behavioral health world don't hear a lot about developmental disabilities. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges we've had has been to find medical professionals who can work with our population, because any psychiatrist will tell you that it is very unusual for developmental disabilities to be included in their curriculum, either in medical school or in residency. The need for one-on-one accommodations is something that occurs because of some behavioral challenges and also because of some physical challenges, and that has been a wonderful opportunity for us to grow our peer specialist program. People who have had lived experience with spectrum challenges are the best people to provide supports to others who are participating in that recovery process. And Stephen, who is one of the people who is going to be presenting in a little while, has in fact completed his peer specialist training and is providing those services for us now. The concept of the stigma of mental illness and IDD, negative attitudes, is something that is really much more evident on an administrative and programmatic level. And as I said, what we found was that when we were able to invite our participants from their respective programs to join with each other, stigma was no longer an issue. They were respectful of each other and for each other's challenges. So, as I said, I was going to explain a little bit more about what a PRO's program is, and these are the characteristics of PRO's programs. Recovery must always be person-centered and strength-based, meaning that when we determine what kinds of services are going to be delivered to an individual in our PRO's program, that's because the individual has told us, these are what my goals are, and these are the services that I need in order to achieve those goals. Recovery planning is dynamic and self-directed. That means that as a person moves through recovery, the blueprint for a person's recovery in a PRO's program is something called an IRP, an individualized recovery plan. And an individualized recovery plan has a shelf life of 6 months, because we recognize that that's how rapidly change occurs. So every 6 months, an individual is going to revise his or her individualized recovery plan to reflect the gains that have been made. PRO's is a transitional program, and the goal is to provide that person with the tools that will help him or her continue to access the appropriate community services after they complete the PRO's curriculum. There are people who participate in our PRO's program for a matter of months, and there are people who participate for a matter of years. And regardless, at some point, even during the time they're in the PRO's program, they're going to be connecting to other community services, and we're going to do whatever we can to help them navigate through that process. One of the things that can be a little bit challenging for folks on the spectrum is the fact that most of our services are delivered in a classroom kind of orientation, and we call our groups classes. And in the course of a week, there may be 120 or so different classes offered, and it covers the gamut. The class can be on understanding family dynamics, it can be on dating, it can be wellness classes centering around nutrition or exercise, socialization classes, vocational classes. For every goal, there are going to be several classes that a person can choose from. Self-governance and advocacy is a really important part of our PRO's program. We have an advisory committee that's composed entirely of our participants, and no changes occur in the PRO's program unless it's been run through our advisory committee. And in fact, nobody gets hired until they've been interviewed by our advisory committee. So self-governance is something that's really important, as is advocacy. We are constantly involved in actions on a local, county, state, even national level to promote the idea of enhancing services that are available for recovery. For folks who have behavioral health challenges, there are many co-occurring disorders frequently, and physical comorbidities are a big challenge, and that may include obesity, metabolic disorders, some neurological challenges, and wellness activities will help decrease the likelihood of some of those physical factors interfering with recovery. And the final point is that all PRO's programs recognize that poverty can contribute significantly to mental health and behavioral health challenges, and that's why housing and vocational support services are incredibly important for all of our participants. So these are the core values that everyone, including folks on the spectrum, are capable of some measure of recovery, and it is, in fact, the outcome that occurs for the vast majority of our participants. And when I say recovery, I want to be clear about the fact that we're not suggesting that somebody who is in a recovery program is going to be able to rid himself or herself of his or her symptoms entirely. For example, and this is not necessarily related to spectrum disorders, but we have people in our program who hear voices, and we may not be able to get them to a point where they will no longer hear voices, but we can get them to a point where they can coexist with those voices and where they can lead very productive lives and have very productive relationships, despite the fact that they may be challenged at times by the voices. These are characteristics of our PRO's program. And as I said, advocacy is something that is really important across the board, and certainly it's true when it comes to spectrum disorders. In our program, we don't ask people to try to disguise the fact that they may have challenges with stimulation and with intrusion of sensory concerns. They acknowledge that, they share that with their fellow participants so that there's a recognition of what each person can do to help the other continue with their recovery journey. And as I said, even though there are going to be some traits that will remain, that doesn't mean that we still can't change and improve. For many of our participants, especially folks who are on the spectrum, PRO's And in order to be eligible for PROS, you must be at least 18 years old. And for many of our participants who are on the spectrum, PROS is their first experience after leaving their educationally based supports. And for many of them, as you well know, losing the school-based supports can be enormously challenging. And we're aware of that, and we work with schools if we're lucky enough to have people begin in our program while they still have the school supports. And even if they've graduated, we will still do everything we can to connect with the schools to get some sense of what a person's IEP and other documentation may give us in way of hints that we can use to help that person continue with their advancement. Our group and classroom presentations are flexible when, especially to help those folks who are on the spectrum. So we have classes that provide more spacing so that there isn't as much of a sense of sensory intrusion. We try to use incandescent lighting wherever we can. We will provide multimodality introduction of materials for people who may have challenges with visually presented material or auditory presented material. We try to be as flexible as we can, and we ask our participants to let us know when the classroom activity is beginning to feel overwhelming so that we can step back and modify on the spot. We recognize that housing independence is really important, and we work actively with families to address this. What we mean by in a timely manner is to begin the process of housing independence when both parents and the participant are relatively young and are able to support each other as they progress to a more independent status. And we're going to get into the weekends are tough in just a moment. I want to introduce Danny. And Danny is going to be, we're going to be hearing Danny speaking in his own words, and it's going to be followed with the words of his parents. And Danny is somebody who was on the spectrum. I'll let him describe some of his experiences, and I'll explain why it's so important to be aware of Danny.
I learned I had Asperger's syndrome when I was 12. Adapting to the social situation is one thing that I find I'm not good at. I guess I was, or am, just a very confused kid. I want to really help people because I feel that having so many services as a kid, I want to give back to this community of people that are willing to help others.
And from this tragedy of Danny's loss, we did develop Danny's PROmiSe, which is the part of our program that is specifically targeted to folks on the spectrum. And we have been the only PROS program in New York State that is authorized to accept people whose primary diagnosis is a developmental disability of any sort, because we have been so careful about making sure our program is appropriate and accessible for people on the spectrum. You heard from Danny. Now I'd like you to hear from his amazing parents.
Hi, I'm Judy Klein.
I'm David Klein.
Danny actually brought Jawonio to us through his involvement in their charitable events and activities over the years. Something about Jawonio spoke to him, and I learned to trust Danny's intuition.
Danny went out and he did his snowboarding, and he was just a regular kid, just like his brothers, but he was always a little bit on the outside. You know, you knew he was being excluded. It's heartbreaking for us.
We would really watch with sadness as he retreated to his room with not much to really coax him out, because he was reaching out, but he wasn't getting a hand reaching back in.
Where the kid with Asperger's, who's just slightly off, has a tougher go of it, and that was Danny's experience.
One of the things we found so sad was watching Danny experience fairly lonely weekends, as though the need for support and services ended at 5 o'clock on Friday. After his passing, there was a GoFundMe page set up to take contributions to honor his memory, and when we thought about what to do with that, Jawonio was the obvious answer. We came up with a concept called Danny's PROmiSe, which is an enhancement of their PROS program. One of the things we specifically wanted to include was the opportunity for Saturday programs, for socializing, for being together with other young adults, for sharing a meal, a laugh, and really cementing friendships. It was a gap that we found in support services throughout his life. Programs like PROS and Danny's PROmiSe enhance lives, and we can't be only about ourselves and who are we. The more that we integrate all members of our community and bring them into the mainstream and in every walk of life, the better we are as a society as a whole. And Jawonio is a catalyst for that. It's tremendously gratifying to know that we've touched hearts and minds, and that Danny continues to touch hearts and minds even after his passing. Sometimes you laugh, sometimes you cry. You know, it's a little bit of both. That's sort of our new reality. But, you know, you try to remember the good stuff. I never want to stop laughing or crying, because I want to keep talking about Danny. I don't want to keep his memory alive, and I want to laugh about all those funny things that he did and said, and all the good times, and cry that he's not here to keep on doing it with us. But it's very important to keep on talking about him, even if sometimes we cry.
How can these videos be found if someone at home would like to rewatch them?
I'm sorry?
How can these videos be found if someone at home wants to rewatch them? Is there something you can search on YouTube to?
Yes, they are on YouTube.
They are on YouTube. Okay.
Yeah. If you look for the Jawonio Foundation, Danny Klein, it can be accessed online. Thank you for asking that.
No problem. Thank you.
And we are just so incredibly honored to be able to create a program that will help ensure that the experience that Danny had will be much less likely to happen for other people who have a similar story to his. I'm now going to step out of the way so that the stars of our presentation can speak. Thomas, although he has not been a participant in our PROS program, has been a participant in our vocational support services here at Jawonio, and is a valued employee at Jawonio at this point, and will share some of his experience in his own recovery journey.
Right. Hello, my name is Thomas Nordstrom. I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2.5, and around when I was in elementary school, like not in, like pre-school and kindergarten, there was a teacher named Mark who saw potential in me, as well as my mother, who is single at the time, that actually like advocated for me and pushed for me because they saw like great potential in me. And eventually I got into self-contained like classes at a elementary school that I held on to self-contained until I got weaving in with a bunch of other people towards my senior year in high school. Over time, like my mom actually married at around 1999, so who actually is an individual who I actually call a dad because I see him as like the father figure that I have not had for the first like 8 years of my life. And after I graduated high school, I went to RCC first for college because that's something I wanted to do, is like go to college, because like it's one of those things, is like this is something I want to do. And I actually got transferred into there through like a summer bridges program around 2008 after I graduated from high school, and I finished RCC with an associate's diploma for mathematics and sciences. I transferred to Dominican College at around 2012 to do like a bachelor's of arts in history. It was also when I met my mentor, who actually I've learned a lot from him, and I felt like there's actually that like trust and understanding we have with one another. And after I graduated from like Dominican College with a bachelor's of arts in history around 2014, it was around 2016 where like my first job, like developer slash job coach, being Vladimir Joseph, helped me come into Jawonio through originally the imaging department that was run by Vic, until late December of 2017, where I got transferred to the Community Employment Services, or CES department, where I'm at today. And I've actually I was at the tech, like the old tech building that's no longer there, when I was like between doing receptioning, filing, whatever else deemed necessary, as said by Isabel Newmeyer. So we're gonna bring that up. And eventually, as of this past December, I've migrated along with everyone else from that building to the new main building, is where I've been working ever since, like doing either filing, data entry, and whatever else deemed necessary. I've recently learned how to use a laminator I taught myself between like reading instructions and such, because someone requested like if I can actually try and laminate something. If I didn't feel comfortable, I would just wait for that individual to come in, but I figured just try, which I did. For the first time, I did pretty well. And so my advice to parents and other individuals who have children of like an actual disability and such is, one, just don't set your goals for them too high. Like, accept them for who they are, like help them, and also push for the avocation if they need the services and such, because that's something I've actually noticed that had to be done in the past. It's like push. And also, like, if they have goals and dreams, like help them pursue them, like as long as they're actually realistically towards what they can actually do. And one other thing is definitely teach them the difference between using soap and water and Purell, because I happen to notice the actual, like, sometimes like certain people treat like soap and water as Purell or vice versa. So I just want to bring that up because that's something I've noticed in the background. And also, if they do anything, just like help them understand what they did wrong and how they can actually make right. So like, just like try to approach it without like trying to like take frustration out on them too much. So that is my advice that I can give to parents. So I hope that actually helps in the long run.
Thank you, Thomas. Thomas is very modest when he says that at the tech building he would do filing and some other clerical tasks. He was frequently the first face that people saw when they came into the building, and he was always a very welcoming presence, and was somebody who had to think on his feet many times, because one day was never the same as the next at the tech building. And Thomas was a critical member of our tech building crew. So thank you for making all of our jobs easier. I'm now going to introduce Stephen, who is a participant in our PROS program, and as I said, has completed the peer specialist training also, and he'll share his story with you.
Thank you. So my name is Stephen Schwartz. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Spring Valley in Rockland County. I am one of 7 sons, and thankfully my parents are still going, still pushing every day. I have a very long history, I guess, with behavioral and mental issues. I have Asperger's, and I was diagnosed in 2017, but before that, in 1996, I was diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome, and later in 2004, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So it's been a fairly interesting ride for me, a very strange journey, but I learned a lot along the way. I'd say the biggest point in my life, the most defining point, came in 2009. I was in college. I was studying for my bachelor's in math, which I eventually got. But at my senior year, I was starting to feel the pressure of the real world. I was unprepared for what was to come. I had no exact plans for employment, and I attempted to take my own life. Thankfully, I survived. I eventually entered a research program and received ECT a number of times, and it really helped me. Despite the stigma around it, it's actually a very good technique and therapy for treating depression. And I left the hospital that year. I continued onward, and I eventually got a job with my brother. I worked there for 8 years, and it was in Brooklyn, and being from Rockland County involved a lot of a very long commute. Every day was about 4.5 hours altogether. So added that onto the workday, and it was not so easy, but I was able to pay off my student loans, which I'm always happy about, because now I don't have any more financial obligations regarding that. And in 2016, I started seeing a therapist, and she almost on the spot recommended Jawonio. I had never actually heard of it. No one had referred me to it before that, and I was somewhat unsure because I had never been part of any kind of day program, or really any program for mental health. There wasn't a lot of support for me growing up, specifically because I hadn't been diagnosed until 2017 with autism spectrum disorder. So when I joined, I was a bit apprehensive. I remember the first day I was hiding in almost like a side room during the community meeting, and people wanted to know if anyone new had joined and if they wanted to say anything, and I was just hoping no one would look at me. But over time, I became very comfortable with the community there, and they really do treat you as if you're part of the community, as if you're one of their own, and I get along with everyone there very well. I think everyone seems to like me as far as from what I've heard. And a very big part of my time at Jawonio was a group called Think Tank, led by a man named Anthony, and essentially you would go up before the group, you would present a little topic. Traditionally, I would do something on either math or English. I would speak for about 40 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes on the topic. Let's say about the etymology of words or a mathematical equation, just kind of expounding on whatever I know about the topic, and then we would take questions afterwards. And this really helped me get comfortable with speaking just at all, really, because before that I was very quiet. I didn't make much eye contact. Now, sometimes I make too much eye contact and try to whittle that down a bit. And those groups really helped me, and they pushed me forward, and because of that, I was then encouraged to go to the peer specialist training, and I completed those courses just last year, and I was able to get my letters of recommendation, and I have officially become a peer support specialist. And that being said, I have also co-facilitated groups at Jawonio. I've led poetry groups, a social anxiety group, and right now I'm currently co-facilitating a story writing group for the second semester in a row. And I feel very comfortable because I know I have the support of the staff, and also the support of the other participants, and they have both been very helpful in guiding me. And an additional thing I'd really like to say is that there hasn't been much emotion in my family, I guess because it's all boys, but there has been a lot of hesitation on my parents' part also to be emotional. So I have said I love you to them maybe once in my life, but honestly, when it comes to the Jawonio staff, I honestly do love them. They have changed me far more for the better than I've ever even thought possible. I thought in 2009 my life, not just being over, was even if it weren't over, it wouldn't go anywhere. I thought I would just be staying at home for the rest of my life. And instead I found a wonderful community who accepts me for who I am, and I've pursued many interests, especially both in terms of hobbies, but also in terms of work. I also completed a bookkeeping course, and I keep just trying to find work, and it's not easy, but I keep pushing through, and it's been challenging, but it's been a good challenge, and it's really helped me grow a lot. And that's more or less what I'm here to say, that the PROscript program has been very helpful in my recovery, and I know it's a very hard road, but recovery definitely is possible. Thank you.
Wait, Stephen, we're not going to let you. Stephen, come on back. Not so fast there, buddy. One of Stephen's talents is poetry, and he agreed to read one of his poems. And Stephen is a man of many layers and many talents, and when it's not enough for him to just do poetry, he also has to make art out of it. And most of his poems are actually presented in a graphic form. This happens to be a circle, and the reason you'll see when he reads his poem why it's a circle, he uses lots of different visual themes to complement his words. So if you could please read your poem, I'd appreciate it.
So this poem is called Imperfect, but it can also be read as I'm Perfect if you insert an apostrophe between the I and the M. This picture isn't a circle, but please don't mourn or gurgle. This perfection is yet another platonic ideal. It has always been sought, but it isn't actually real. For every circle has but an infinite number of sides, not pixelated screens, but with curves like ocean tides. We are unlike this round shape, and we can only be finite, but we can still strive to improve ourselves and align right. See, life is not about perfection, rather it's about getting better. To be perfect is to have no goals, and that really is just a fetter. Thus, to be perfect is to be imperfect, and certainly vice versa. Life's boundaries may limit you, but they are not a curse. A wise man once said God envies his own creations. That's because he's all alone in his infinite desolation. But as humans have each other, limited as we are, and standing tall together, we will end up far. You aren't without flaws, and that's okay. I'll take my flaws, my imperfections, over his loneliness and eat at it.
That was awesome.
Stephen does a much better job than I in encapsulating what the PROS program and what recovery is all about. And Stephen's one of the reasons, and all of the participants in the PROS program, they were among the reasons that it was so hard for me to make the decision to retire, because it's hard not to be enjoying the accomplishments of folks like Stephen every day. And it's really been an amazing journey for me. I'll just quickly address some of the challenges that we all face in New York State, because we do live in a state that has this siloed system. We have separate funding for services for people with developmental disabilities, separate funding for people with behavioral health challenges, separate funding for labor concerns, educational issues, and that lack of integration unfortunately trickles down to programs. So it's very hard to find a program that will address multiple needs at the same time. And that was the reason that we worked so hard to develop Danny's PROmiSe, because we wanted to be able to bring recovery principles into the developmental disability world. And we did it by meeting with the county officials, the state officials, and New York State currently is fortunate in that our Commissioner of Mental Health, Dr. Sullivan, is someone who understands the totality of the people that are receiving services, and she was willing to give us the opportunity to develop this model, and we did that about 5 or 6 years ago, and we continue to grow the model today. In addition to our PROS program, we also have an intensive outpatient program, and because of time constraints, I'm not going to really get into the weeds on this. I will just say that people with developmental disabilities are not immune from acute emotional stress, just like the rest of us are. And the intensive outpatient program is intended to provide that kind of acute care for people who are going through a particularly difficult crisis. And we have restructured our IOP-like program to accommodate the additional needs for people who are on the spectrum. We, as I said, are always encouraging advocacy and fairness. Stephen is one example of a peer specialist in our program. We have actually graduated upwards of 20 peer specialists since our program began, and they are working not just at Jawonio, but in other behavioral health programs too. We all know that the peer support program is critical to developing and delivering appropriate behavioral health services. We have created a sensory-friendly environment, and sometimes that was swimming against the tide also. We had created a room that we identified as a sensory-friendly room, and we were getting an inspection from the Office of Mental Health, and I was very proud to introduce them to the sensory-friendly room and show them all that we had done. And right after I showed them the room, they said, "You can't have that room, you have to shut it down. You cannot have a room that's called a sensory-friendly room, because it's the suggestion is that it's only there for people who have sensory challenges." And we then went back to the drawing board, renamed it, called it the Tranquility Room, made it available to everyone, and now it's there. And in that Tranquility Room, we have a beanbag chair, we have a lounge chair that is designed as a zero gravity chair, incandescent lighting, pleasing white noise, anything that will help a person recover in the short term from sensory overload. It's open to anyone who participates in our PROS program. And for those of you that do work in the spectrum world, it's not that much different from a snooze room. The staff response to our integrated program has been phenomenal. The staff sees it as an opportunity to grow their own experience and to do something that is relevant to people who are traditionally underserved. And what we have found also is that because of the input from our staff and our integration with the medical practitioners who provide service. Now, we do have a psychiatrist and a nurse practitioner in our program, and some people in our program continue to go to their own prescribers, and we have found that the prescribers have changed some of their practices because they've become more aware of the fact that repetitive behavior, for example, for somebody who may be on the spectrum is not necessarily the same thing as OCD. And in fact, if you treat it as OCD, you may be doing more harm than good. And we feel that we've been able to have a significant impact. Further on in the series that we at Jawonio are presenting, Dr. Russ Toby at the Nathan Klein Institute is going to be talking about some of the advances in pharmacological treatment and in diagnosis, and I would certainly encourage you to participate in that program. I don't think it's going to be happening until the spring. He's a leader in the field and a brilliant researcher. I spoke about some of the accommodations that we've made, and if you would like any additional information, this is my contact information. And if you would like information about the PROS program, this is the man who is now the director of the PROS program, and you can certainly contact him. So thank you for sharing your time with us, and especially want to thank Thomas and Stephen for sharing their story with us, and join us in our next session.